All right, so last week we heard about the plan to enter the Holy Land where God seemed to be moving the Israelites right along. And today we have the people's reaction to what was said last week. So just a quick refresh of what we covered last week. God told Moses and Aaron to send out some spies. The spies spent 40 days collecting things. And they said, yep, the land is great. Look at this huge bunch of grapes we found. And but the spies also said the cities are fortified. There are strong people there. The people might actually be the descendants of giants. And so now we get the reaction to the land is fertile, but the cities are walled and the people are huge. So jumping in right away, the first thing that the people do is they absolutely freak out, the congregation of the Israelites. And I'm curious what your all's thoughts are just right out of the gate of this initial panic that the Israelites go into. They have their complaints and their responses. Larry, what do you think?
Here we go again.
Yes.
It sounds familiar, I take it.
Yeah, right.
So what parts of the complaint sound familiar? Like, what have we heard before?
Yeah, they actually almost use the same words. You know, we were better off in Egypt. We should have stayed there. This time, though, they go a little farther. They said, let's go find a leader to take us back to Egypt.
Yeah, that's a dramatic statement, isn't it? Like, let's actually put some plans because we thought we wanted this, but we don't actually think we want this anymore. Other thoughts or reactions to their freak out here?
I think it's a natural reaction. I probably would too, except that they forgot about the promise that they would be taken care of and that they would be able to move into that land. They just forgot all about that in their anger and being upset.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, Mary Ellen?
Well, the Lord responds the same way he did in the past. And yet I'm surprised he even took time to talk about it to Moses, that he didn't just clear the decks. I'm done with you, you know. But I wondered, is this really the 10th time that I saw mentioned in the passage? I haven't count, but is it really the 10th one?
So I looked into that actually a little bit. It looks like this is a turn of phrase just to mean frequently. That it's one of those that like, I know we get futzy with the numbers and we can talk about the 40 days and 40 years thing in a moment, but this seems to be just one of those phrases of like, you're complaining to me often. And they're using a number, but it seems to be just the phrase of frequently. They're not going to, I don't think there's probably someone who has gone through and counted how many times they've complained, but I don't think it hits 10.
I've told you 1,000,000 times not to do that.
Right.
Right. Yeah. The numbers are weird. So.
Yeah, it seems to be a human thing to, once it gets to a certain point of frustration, you can pick any number you want to make it.
See, Logan and I joke about this one at home a lot because it turns out there's a phrase that I use very differently than him. When I ask for a couple of things, he will bring me 2 things. Okay. He brings me a couple, where I tend to think of a couple as like 3 or 4-ish. So you can see how even in our language, we don't always obey numbers. And they've done surveys of people of like, how many does a couple mean? And there tends to be the people who take it literally and the people like me who are like, it's just like a couple, a few.
Yeah, see, you need a few.
Right. So I want to draw out a few things because this are a few more things about this complaint. Larry, you actually hit one of them because this complaint is a little bit different than some of the other ones. first of all, they do make a plan to like, hey, let's walk back to Egypt. They'll probably take us back. We can have our heads hung and we can go back. There's a few other elements to this complaint where they're kind of building on their initial complaints that they've said in the past. So notably, there's no mention of food this time, which is often food or water has been their typical complaints before. And we don't hear about like the cook pots in Egypt and the vegetables overflowing. But this time they even state, would we have died in the wilderness? So they're almost saying like, hey, you should have just let us starve. Instead of complaining about starving, it's like, you should have let us starve. And it's like, why are you bringing us to this land to fall by the sword? And there's also the threat of our women and our children. So this also seems like it is coming mainly from the male point of view of like, our women and our children are going to be taken. We're going to be killed. We should have just all perished before. And the thing that I find interesting is what happens when people get exactly what they want and they find out that they don't want what they thought they wanted. So any reflections on that, of the fact that they are actually getting everything that they've requested in Egypt, but they never imagined it would be this hard? So what do you all think of kind of that dynamic? Have you all had a time where you got exactly what you wanted and you're like, oh shoot, why did I wish for this? I was mistaken. Yeah, Mary Ellen?
Well, I have found that the things that I have to work the hardest to get have roadblocks every which way I turn trying to accomplish something or acquire something. And the harder I have to work to get it, the more I'm disappointed in it when it happens. But yeah, I'm not happy with the result of it. But it depends on how hard I worked to make it happen. So anyway, it just, I've had many times where I haven't really wanted what I thought I did. So.
Sure.
Yeah. See, it's interesting because I feel like sometimes the effort enhances the end product and sometimes it makes it feel like a waste of time. Like I know on the one side, like the classes where I had a professor that was like more hard on me and like you can't just like do the bare minimum and get the A. The one that they're like you put in effort, I'm so much more proud of those grades for the professors that were actually pushing and challenging. But at the same time, there are projects and other things I have started where it's like, oh, this will be an easy project. It'll be an hour. And then like days later, I'm like, why am I still doing this? Why did I try to do this fix myself? I would be better off if I had just like not actually done this because I have wasted time. And now it's worse than it is before. And so I feel like there's like the two sides of it, that sometimes the effort makes it worth it. And then sometimes you're like, why? Why did I do this?
Why did I work so hard to accomplish something I now don't want? So.
So the people evidently are somewhat regretting their choice to leave because they are being asked to put in effort. And we kind of talked about last time that while they were in the Exodus story, God basically just told them to sit and wait. And God was going to do everything for them. And their leaving Egypt was just going to like fall into their laps. Sit still and wait for God and then go when God says go. Now God's kind of asking for participation, and they seem to be much more panicked when God's asking for them to be a part of this process. Mary Ellen, yeah?
The part of their reaction is based on the false information the spies gave them. Isn't that true?
So that's the other side of this, is like, what does it mean to be a leader? And these leaders come back and they think they're protecting the people by giving them this negative report. And there's only one or two people that are saying, yeah, let's do this, God's on our side. And then the other ones are doom and gloom, and they like, what does it mean to be a leader when people's responses are based on your personal reaction?
Moses and Aaron did exactly what I'm not surprised at their response to all of this. You know, throw yourself on the ground and just, that didn't surprise me at all. I wouldn't like them at least.
Yeah.
I was kind of surprised that God didn't seem to be prepared for this kind of thing, that he didn't know these people better.
Yeah.
Uh-huh. Like, God, did you not anticipate that they would freak out?
Well, no, he should. I would have never thought that God would be so out of touch with his people, that he would have kind of expected this kind of reaction and be a little bit prepared to deal with it.
So how do you think the story would have gone differently if God was more prepared for this reaction?
I think he would have threatened them ahead of time and said, if you don't, stick with me and the plan that I've laid out for you, then this is the consequence. And giving the people, a heads up, hey, you're either with me or, but he didn't, if he knew ahead of time, that's what I think his response would have been.
Gary? Oh, Larry?
Yeah, I was thinking God might be using this sort of as a test of the Israelite people. He told them, get 70 men or however, go there, have them get a report, come back and tell you, with the expectation they'll come back and tell them how wonderful it is and so forth. But what happens if they don't listen to these people, that they're not really following what God had intended? And I guess, like God is free to do what he wants, to a lesser extent, the Israelites are free to sort of do what they want, but, they may not control the consequences.
Any other thoughts on how God could have prepared the people differently for this situation that could have steered the outcome? I get what you're saying, Larry, of like, in their agreements, God has said, like, you follow me, I will be your God. And that's kind of been the arrangement. So this is one of those of like, God's saying like, okay, now you're going to follow. And the people are like, we don't want to.
Yeah.
So you have that kind of mismatch. Other thoughts on how God could have prepared differently for this?
Possibly he could have had Moses be more encouraging and more of a leader at this point. But I don't know. It just that might have made it run a little smoother.
I will say, this is part of, oh, Helen, are you trying to say something? Check your mute.
You're mute, Helen, you're muted.
Thank you. I had to answer the phone. Anyway, it seems to me that God shouldn't have to tell them all these things ahead of time. He told them a long time ago he would lead them and he would make them successful, and they had to trust him. Now, why should he have to say anything more than that? I just didn't feel that he didn't have to, and that they should have remembered. They didn't, but I think they should have remembered that, and they should do what God said. I mean, it's just like when I go to the doctor, he tells me to do a certain thing. I'm paying him money to do this, and he tells me to do something, and I do it. Because if I didn't want to do it, I wouldn't go to the doctor.
So one of the things that's actually in question is, how do people respond to authority?
Yeah. Yeah. And you can
Think they
look
were stupid.
from the Israelite standpoint, 70 men come back. 2 of them say the place is great. 68 of them said it's full of giants. We're going to be slaughtered. They're going to sell our children. Whom are the Israelites going to listen to? The only ones talking to them are these representatives that have come back. God isn't saying anything to them.
Are they going to listen to God, or are they going to listen to people?
Well, eventually they'll listen to God.
Well,
Yeah.
they better get at it.
Yeah, Mary Ellen?
Well, I probably missed it in my reading of the text, but what was their reason for not telling the truth about the land? Why did the 68 lie and not want the Israelites to continue on the journey? I kind of missed that point.
I don't think they necessarily lied, as in their reaction was different. I like what they said was accurate, but I think the way, this is one of those where the way you say information is different than the content of what you're saying, because you could list facts like the land is great, the cities are fortified, the people are big, but if you say it kind of in a flat tone, that's where people sometimes say objectivity is you say the facts, no fluff, you don't emphasize it one way or the other. The way they presented it sounded like, hey, the land's great, but oh no, there's giants. That leads people to focus on the panic, versus if you were to say it the other way of hey, the cities are fortified, there are some big people, but hey, the land is great. That presentation focuses on the land is great and can we handle the giants? And so I feel like the people being misled aren't being lied to. I think their focus is being shifted to one aspect of the land.
Mm-hmm.
So the 68 who were focusing on that, why didn't they want the Israelites to continue their journey?
Because they thought that the cities are strong enough that this ragtag group of former slaves aren't going to be strong enough to basically lay siege to a fortified city, and the people are giants. And it's referenced in the chapter before that they are the descendants of the Nephilim. And the Nephilim are the product of angels having mating with human women and creating the giants of old. And that's happening back for Noah. So these are the giants and the heroes of old. These are the descendants of the Nephilim, and they're considered mighty warriors. So it would be not dissimilar today to saying, oh, that dude is the descendant of a gladiator. And that kind of gives us that kind of mental image of what does a gladiator look like and what would that look like today.
Okay.
So did I see someone's hand trying to jump in? Okay. So there's a few things popping into my head that I find interesting in your all's conversation is, as I kind of mentioned, what is our people's response to authority? And frankly, God's kind of acting almost like a general, which leans on the more authoritarian style of power. And I say that descriptively, not with a judgmental statement, but it's one of those that if you're used to a hierarchical system, when you say a command, you are used to people following and not questioning. And that seems to be the mode of operation that God is working with right now, is God's just saying, hey, send out spies. Okay, and now we're going to go. And it's just that expected, you are going to follow the orders that I'm giving you, right?
Mhm.
And people don't always respond well to that. There are types of people that do, and there's types of people that really hate that style of leadership.
Mhm.
But there's also the interplay of the spies and how they're giving information.
Mhm.
But the other thing that has me curious, kind of going back to Gary, your question, is I wonder what would have been different if before the spies went out, the conversation was more like, hey, we know that there's people here already. This isn't going to be easy, but we can handle it. We need to send out people to scope out what's going on so we know how to respond.
Mhm.
How is that different than just go and report back?
Right.
Mhm.
Yeah, Mary Ellen?
Sending out 70 spies is almost like sending out a small army. To me, you know, if you're sending out spies, you want them to be discreet and you want them to blend in, or what, 70 unknown people infiltrating your land has to raise an alarm with residents. And so I'm seeing a conflict here to begin with too.
So the one thing that, if you look at maps, might help this out is these were trading routes. So the land of Canaan is considered backwater. For its entire existence through the Roman Empire, it's not considered a metropolis. It's basically a stopping station along a route from Egypt up through, like, you would go through this area to get to Greece, or you would go to this area to get farther east. And so this is a trading route. So probably they're used to seeing people just pass through here. So they may blend in more or less because this is kind of on that caravan route. But 70 people is a significant amount of people if they're traveling together. I think the thought is they may have dispersed a little bit and come back.
How dispersed could 70 people, or even if 70 means a large number, how dispersed? I'm looking at the map in the Bible on 219, and Canaan isn't a very wide east to west land.
No.
I'll be quiet, but that just
Yeah.
resonates.
Yeah, Larry?
Well, at least they don't mention anything happening.
Yeah.
Apparently these 70 men went out, scouted out the place, and came back. And the import may have nothing to do with how many went out, how many came back, but more with what happened. What they said, what the report influenced what the Israelites did. And what that result was, that according to God, is they had forgotten that he had promised that he would get them to the promised land. And they've lost that faith. They're not talking about hiring somebody to ferry them back to Egypt and so forth.
Right. So let's keep us moving in the story, because this is actually kind of a beefy chapter and we should probably get to some of the latter stuff too. So needless to say, the people are not excited. And so they're having their little freak out moment. But Joshua and Caleb, they were the ones that came back with the report that said, hey, this is good. And they kind of respond to the people saying, and kind of, Helen, is more the perspective you were putting out there. If the Lord is pleased with us, we'll do fine. Like, God's on our side. God told us to do this. It's gonna be fine. And the people threatened to stone them for having a positive, like, hey, we can do this. So, I mean, this sometimes happens when you're the person trying to cast what people think is doom and gloom in a positive light. People don't respond well. But this is when God jumps in and responds, basically saying, how long will these people despise me? How long will they still refuse to believe me, in spite of all the signs I have done among them? I will strike them with pestilence and disinherit them. I will make of you a greater nation. And the notes are saying that this is likely saying not just like Moses, but there's like a small group of people that God's kind of sectioning out, saying, I'm going to kill the rest of them, but like you, I can work with you. It's just the rest of these people where God seems to like blow up again and say, nope, I'm tired of being blamed. I'm trying to do a good thing and these people don't want it. So what do you think of God's response here? Is like, do you is it reasonable? Is it understandable?
Well, it's the same thing that happened the first time.
Mm-hmm.
He threatened to kill them all, and Moses intervened, and now it's going to happen all over again.
Right. So again, Moses intervenes, and his statement's very similar to his interventions before. So like, what's familiar and how Moses responds? Because there's a few arguments that Moses goes back to again and again of why just God should not like annihilate all the people. Is there anything that sounds like vaguely familiar in this? There is, at least in verse 18, there's a refrain that we've seen before.
It seems like Moses is the one that keeps coming back to God to ask him to be reasonable, to have some understanding and some forgiveness for the people. And I suppose that's what makes Moses so great, is he challenges the Lord to, give us a break. This is all new to us, and they're doing the best that they can, and to our, well, whatever. That's enough.
Yeah. The way you said that, it reminds me of how sometimes older siblings will protect their younger siblings for a parent who's just like, they've had enough. It's the end of the day. And like one of the little ones breaks something and they're like, hey, mom, I know you're mad. The little one didn't mean to do this. Yes, they broke something, but remember, they're small. They're still learning these things. Their coordination's not the best. So like, hang on. Have you seen older siblings do that, where they kind of stand in the middle and go like, don't freak out too much, mom. We broke something, but we didn't mean to.
Right.
But Moses's reminder once again is like, hey, remember, the world is watching. You had this big display in Egypt. You brought the people out. If you kill the people now, the rest of the world is going to think you're an incompetent god, basically. They're going to think that you couldn't actually like find a place to like put these people, so you just killed them. You brought them out and you killed them, and like, what? You don't want Egypt to laugh at you. You don't want Cana to laugh at you. They're going to think you couldn't conquer us. Like, come on. Think of what the world will say. Yeah, Mary Ellen.
Well, the world will also say, don't follow this Lord because he kills off his people.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, who's going to want to follow that God?
Yeah.
Yeah, Larry?
The other interesting thing is they're saying explicitly the whole world is going to know. Almost as if Egypt is going to say it's the Israelites' God's reason that all this fell apart, And I wonder how they all have that great connection, how the Egyptians knew what the Israelite God was telling them,
Mm-hmm. I mean, if there is a large group of thousands of people that perish in the wilderness after leaving Egypt, the world probably would take notice if a huge clan of people died. and they would speculate, but I think it's in this way they're saying, hey, the world's gonna blame you if they find this big group of dead people in the desert. But Gary, did I see you have a thought?
No, the same thing, that the word would have traveled.
Mm-hmm.
As-
Mm-hmm. So after Moses once again talks down God and says, hey, remember your promises, remember the world's watching, remember people aren't going to want to follow you if you do this, God changes the plan of action. Not going to kill them immediately, but also none of these people are going to enter the land that I have promised. It kind of flips around. And the thought is that, hey, we're going to turn around. You don't want to enter the land? We're not going to enter the land. We can work with that. Like you said you wanted to leave Egypt, we left Egypt. You say you don't want to enter the promised land, well, guess what? You're never going to. They get what they want again. And then the thought is, you never get to enter the promised land because you rejected it when I brought it before you. So you're going to stay in the wilderness. Your children are going to be shepherds, and every one of you will be buried in the desert until this entire generation has passed away. So what do you think of that? Is God giving them what they want, or is it punishment?
Sounds like punishment.
It's both. He gives them their life rather than slaughtering them all. But the punishment is they're going to wander forever in their lifetime. So I think it's both.
Mm-hmm.
Maybe God's way of telling them, if you'd only listened to me, you could have saved 40 years.
Mm-hmm.
your people will get to the promised land, but not you.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So culturally, what does it do to have an entire generation pass away before they are ready for the next step? Why would God choose to have let's see, skipping, or there's like two sections of God responding to this, which are probably, I mean, as we've often seen, they're probably from different sources. They make sense together, so they smushed them together. But in verse 29, this is where we get some of the details of exactly how this is going to work. And it's very vivid. Your dead bodies shall fall in the wilderness, and your number included in the census from 20 years old and upwards who complained against me. So the line that is drawn is the census that was taken at the beginning of Numbers. At the beginning of Numbers, we have that list of names that I told you it existed. We're not going to look at it. All of those people have to pass away. Notably, the census is for fighting aged people. So the census is partially to take a number of how many people they would have if they needed to form rank and file and attack someone. And so the thought is that number, which is 20-year-olds and older, that entire group of people is going to pass away. So what does this do to a group of people? Like, those are the ones that left Egypt. Those are the ones who experienced God passing over. Those are the ones who saw the parting of the Red Sea. Those are the ones who both like experienced the golden calf. They are the ones who like signed on yes to the covenant that was initially expressed. They are the ones who saw the tablets, who built the tabernacle, who built the Ark of the Covenant. These are the group of people we have been journeying with since the beginning of Exodus. And God is saying this entire group of people will pass away. What changes with that thought that this group is not ready for the promised land and they never will be? They will pass away in the wilderness.
What was the question?
So what changes in culture with that kind of transition where you have a group of people who have seen a lot, but they are going to pass away, and the group that's ready to go into the promised land are the people who saw none of it? What's the difference culturally or mindset wise? What changes between those two groups of people? Yeah, Mary Ellen?
Well, you're wiping out the generation that has literally been a thorn in God's side from the beginning. They have been the Israelites, but they have never really fully gotten the picture, that they're always arguing or, going against his mission or whatever he's saying he wants them to do. They end up complaining and carrying on and doing it, and then complaining and carrying on afterwards. They just have never quit. And so you're wiping out that entire train of thought.
Mm-hmm.
And you're going to the next generation, which I don't understand why he punishes the younger children, that they become the shepherds in the land and they won't see the promised land either, is how I read it. I don't understand why they get punished. But the next generation who sees the promised land is absolutely pure of any of this troublesome thinking, challenging of the Lord, of, whatever. That slate has been wiped clean by wiping out this entire generation.
Mm-hmm.
It takes a while, it takes, all that time for them to die off naturally, but
Mm-hmm.
But wouldn't the younger generation that's going to go to the promised land be better prepared after living with and hopefully learning from the experiences of their elders? So it's kind of a cleansing and a more dedicated group to move into the promised land.
Mm-hmm.
Oh, look what's happening in our country today. Children are
Joe, did you have a thought there?
I guess so. I think look what's happening to our generation of children now who didn't live through World War II or so forth, and as the generations go down, it's the thought and the background, the history tends to be forgotten unless it's taught.
Mm-hmm.
They don't background unless it's given to them.
There's actually one theory of war that I wish I could remember whose theory this is, but there's like a cycle of like, there's the people who experience war and like firsthand, and they have all the trauma and the bad parts, and they have in their brain, in their mind, like all the horrors of it. And then the next one is like, you have the generation of children who grew up with parents of war. So like they didn't experience it firsthand, but maybe it's like they knew what it was like to live in rations. But dad came home and dad never talked about it, but like would wake up in the night screaming. And so they have that like secondhand vicarious knowledge of war because they saw the after effects. They grew up during the rebuilding after war. And then the third generation, the children of the children, they tend to be the ones that hear more glamour. That's when war starts to be remembered and more glorified, because the stories they only know stories. And people will tell stories of the valor of war and the honorableness. And it's then their children who, like, once again, you have stories distilled, and it's thought to be the fourth generation in this theory that is more willing to go into war because they are so separated from it, that they think of it as an honorable thing because they have no experience of the horror of it. And so it's actually one of the thoughts of, I hear this in conversations of like, why is the world breaking out into war in a very visceral way? And it's thought because we are now so distant from some of it that we have forgotten the very tangible experience of war, and we are starting to get firsthand horrors again. And so the thought is, does the cycle start over again?
Yeah.
That is a theory. There is a lot of critiques of it. One of them being the United States has very few years where they have not been actively engaged in some combat, but it's like it's based on the idea of like major breakouts of war. There's also the question, or when the person kind of ignores the difference between World War I and World War II in this model. So like I'm not saying there aren't critiques of it, but it is an interesting thought pattern of like this kind of cycle of what does it mean to remember and what does it mean to forget? But there's another aspect of this that that often makes it into the commentaries, is that these people aren't necessarily just forgetting about battle and war. The question is this initial generation, they were enslaved. And the question is, will they ever understand themselves to be free, or will they always be runaway slaves in their minds? Will they always have that memory of captivity, and so they don't know what it means to be free? So do you need that generation who has that conception of themselves to pass away and have a generation that has only known freedom? So what do you think of that? Of these people, one of the reasons they're a thorn in God's side is because they have this memory of Egypt. The good, the romanticized, but they were also captives. They remember what it was like for someone else to make the decisions and not really have power. And so they need free children in order to actually make the next step into being a nation.
That all makes sense. It's
Okay.
another, they're not carrying baggage. They can go into the promised land with a more open approach to the whole thing.
So bringing it kind of more of like life application, because I think this is one of the parts where it's an interesting, like we can talk, I mentioned what it, like the cycles of war theory, but there's also the thought of like, what does it actually take to address issues that happen in a family? And can you actually make changes to family structure in one generation? Or is it one of those things that addressing harm and wrongs that have done, does it take multiple generations to actually address family dynamics? Larry, you're shaking your head there.
Well, I have no concept.
Okay, fair enough.
No way to judge
Mm-hmm.
that, I don't know. That would be
Okay.
I just don't know.
I bring this up because it's interesting seeing the way people talk. If you've ever encountered people who either have like experienced domestic violence or are the children of people who experience domestic violence, or if there's like alcoholism or drug abuse in families, there tends to be a difference between the child of an alcoholic versus the grandchild of an alcoholic, or the spouse that experienced domestic violence, the child that experienced domestic violence, or the child of the parent that experienced domestic violence, but they never themselves did. That there are certain patterns that kind of have these echoings. And I think it's just something good to be aware of, that there's like down the line ramifications, because a lot of these things have coping mechanisms and they're not always, or it's interesting seeing how coping mechanisms can just travel through family lines. So
Coping mechanisms develop in response to some sort of stress
Mm-hmm.
in the family. And if you've got the same stress going on, you're probably going to get similar coping mechanisms going down through a family. Whereas if the stress changes each generation, you might have a different set of coping mechanisms.
Yeah. Yeah, Mary Ellen, though?
And this is only from personal experience, but I did work with the Superior Court in Arizona for several years with children in foster care, and they're, i.e., victims of domestic violence in their home or severe alcoholism or the situations you're talking about. And the first generation, of course, are the people directly involved. Second generation tends to find themselves in the same situation where the child of an alcoholic has greater chances of becoming an alcoholic, or a child in the home of domestic violence feels that this is how people are treated, this is what's normal, and then therefore gets involved in the situation themselves. But the third generation, and this is just from my experience, is highly against the situation of their grandparents and parents to the point of activism about it. And it's following the pattern that you're talking about, and the pattern that I'm seeing, what we're discussing today, that it goes on to the third generation to clear the memory, the actions from the people coming up, that it takes away the people who are directly involved and allows a new train of thought, goal, purpose in life, outlook on life. So that's just me. So
Somehow it seems to me that you talk about the generations, the how do they call that? The third or fourth generation can change, but it carries down through. You carry the sins of your parents, or you carry the sins for 3 or 4 years.
Yeah.
Is that not something I've heard
3
before?
or 4
Generations?
Yeah. Yeah, that actually, back in verse 18, we see a little bit of this in what Moses says back to God to like kind of calm him down, is the Lord is slow to anger, abounding in steadfast love, forgiving iniquities and transgressions, but by no means clearing the guilty, visiting the iniquities of the parents upon the children. And we've talked about this before, because I would argue that is descriptive, because it describes what we see actually happen, not that God is like punishing children for their parents' sins. It's kind of an admission that like, hey, this you live with the ramifications of what you put into the world. So you're right, Joe. We have talked about it. But Mary Ellen, did I see?
It's like a cleansing.
So one way to kind of look at this situation a little bit differently, which this is me reading into the text. This is not necessarily what the text, I would say this is not what the text is saying, but it's a charitable reading. Is this kind of going with what Larry said, is like God is testing these people out. And in this test, is it that they failed, as in they are a rejected people, or was it a discovery that no, they're not actually ready yet? Because do not forget, these people were enslaved brutally. And so do they need time to heal? Do they need time to recover from, like, slavery is fundamentally abusive. And so they were in an abusive situation. Is this kind of giving the nation a chance to collectively heal from the trauma of slavery? I think that's a more charitable reading of this, that like, hey, maybe you actually aren't ready. we're going to give you some time, and maybe your children will be ready, because we need time to heal as a people group. Not just as individuals and families, but this is a collective trauma. I think a way you can think about it is that why things like World War I and World War II are such big global memories is because it was a worldwide trauma event. And we have occasionally these things that are so massive that it's almost like everyone needs to stop and breathe and kind of take into account what happened. But Mary Ellen, I saw a hand.
I was just gonna say, that's what I meant by a cleansing, what you're
Yeah.
talking about, cleansing of the memory, or the impact of the memory.
Mm-hmm. Right.
And then you get the group that doesn't believe it happened or starts over again.
Mm-hmm.
The violence against Jews.
Deniers.
I just like, wait a minute. How can you say this? You know, how we're saying of our generation, how can this be? And yet
Mhm.
it's the younger generations that are reacting.
Mhm.
That's my impression.
Mhm.
From the young people I've talked to, I think this is one where I'm cautious of the way that that I see it often reported in the news, is that with the situation in Gaza, I don't think there are people who deny the Holocaust, which I just do not understand. But what a lot of younger folk are seeing is that, hey, like the Holocaust was real, but that doesn't give people permission to brutalize another group of people. And they're seeing violence done to another group of people, saying, hey, that's also wrong. And so that is more, it's not denying that the violence of previous generations happened. It's saying like, hey, pay attention to this generation as well. What's happening, the violence happening here is more what I hear. Anyways, putting that on the side, we have about 8 minutes left. The one part I very much want to address is what happens after God kind of sends out or like decrees this. Moses translates it to the people and says, hey, you're going to stay in the wilderness. Like, you wanted to stay in the wilderness, you got your wish, you're going to stay here, you're going to die here, your children will go into the promised land, you're going to stay here for 40 years. And then there's a group of people that says, oh no, we don't want this punishment. Let's go and let's do what God said to do beforehand. Let's prepare for battle. Let's go to the Amalekites and the Canaanites. Let's actually gather an army. God wanted us to attack. So let's go attack now.
Mhm.
And so what do you think of this response of when God threatens punishment, they're like, oh no, we can do this, we can do the military, we can attack. And they kind of gather up an army and they go. What do you think of this response?
Well, it didn't turn out well.
No. So why are they doing this impulse though? Why do it now?
Well, I think this again serves as an illustration. If the Israelites had only believed that God was on their side and would protect them, they could have avoided all of this if they'd only kept up their belief. The fact that they have lost it and now they try to go off on their own, it's just another disaster.
So why is it different to try to do this now versus if they tried to do this at the beginning of the chapter? Like what changed to make this a bad idea?
Well, they didn't decide to do this until they were threatened to die in the remain in the desert and die there.
Mm-hmm.
So
Yeah, Mary Ellen?
Well, they aren't following God's will in this action. They're following their own. They made the decision that this would be one way to appease God, to do his will now rather than when it was asked of them. And, they're taking over and taking charge again, and it didn't work out.
Right. Sometimes there is a time limited response, and they
Yeah.
are now outside the window of the proper response time.
Mm.
Yes.
Well, and Aaron and Moses had said, don't do this. The Lord isn't with you. But they went ahead anyway.
So that shows that there's actually a fundamental misunderstanding of what God initially told them to do. And I wonder if you all caught it. So one of the reasons why Moses and Aaron said, don't do this, is because the Ark of the Covenant wasn't going to go with them.
Right.
Which means they assume by doing this, they're thinking that they can attack this people on their own.
Oh.
Which means they never understood that beforehand why they would be successful is because it wasn't up to them. Just like in Egypt, God was going to do the big action. It had nothing to do with the people's power or strength and everything to do with God. But they didn't trust God. They were thinking about their own power. And now they're doing this by their own power, and it turns out they were right. They, as a people group, were not strong enough, and they were never going to be, because it wasn't about them. So you see all along that they had a misunderstanding of why it would work when God said go.
Mhm.
So they go up and they get their butts kicked.
Mhm. They do.
So what do we think of this whole chapter here of the people's reaction, God's reaction, and then their final attempt to stay in God's favor and do the thing that God told them to do, but too late, and failing because they were doing it on their own strength? So what do you think of this kind of movement and the realization now that the 40 years in the wilderness starts now?
Yeah. Well, the chapter explains why it does.
Yeah.
Mhm.
And my question is, when will they ever learn? Because as the story continues, they still haven't learned lessons. So
So my question is, have we even learned?
No.
Have we learned their lesson?
you know, it's hard because they had direct communication from the Lord,
Mm-hmm.
and that's what they were choosing to defy. We don't experience that, and particularly as a people, and so it's a very hard question to answer.
So what are the things that make church and I'm not talking about like this congregation or like Royal Oak First, but kind of collectively, I would say the Christian, at least like mainline denominations, they're in a moment of panic right now, most of them. What are people panicking about? Like what makes so many churches anxious at the moment?
Loss of membership.
Mhm.
Mm-hmm.
Right.
What are connected with that loss of membership? What's going on influencing that?
Lost.
I think they're afraid they'll die, that they will not continue.
Mm-hmm. So loss of membership meaning like churches are gonna close, and that kind of, what does it mean for the organization we have spent so much time and energy with closing its doors? Mm-hmm.
Also, and I'm seeing a parallel to what we've just been discussing, that congregations tend to be more senior citizens now than younger people who will be able to carry it on. And so it's almost like an entire generation is going to be eliminated when we all pass away. And following, the discussion we've been having, Will the next ones, the children of the dedicated members now, carry on? What will their children do? What is, the long foresight of churches when we go through these generations? On the long term, it follows this 3-generation thing we've been talking about.
Right. So it's not just that we have less church people overall, we have missing demographics. Like, I know with Northminster, we don't have children. We have a few youth that are connected with members, but those youth didn't choose to join the church. And so the question is, what happens? What happens with this generation when it passes away? And that's a real anxiety. Any other thoughts of some of the fears going on?
I think the fear goes beyond the walls of the church. I think that our culture has less respect for character and ethics and morality and so forth. So that the concern is beyond membership. It's the entire culture that has been disappointing.
Yeah. It's a good point.
So
Responsibility and respect.
So how do we respond in a way that isn't like the Israelites? They freak out and say, oh no, it's like, it would be better if we were just wiped off the map. Oh ho hum, we should have just closed our doors. Oh ho hum, our culture's going to hell. Like that defeatist, like, we might as well give up, it's no use anyways. How do we respond differently to the changes that are afoot?
I think that's the big question. And I think we've been struggling trying to find the answer of how do we turn this around?
Yeah. So this is probably not one with easy answers. This is the question I'm going to let you all sit with this week is, if we know that the Israelites responded incorrectly, how do we not repeat their mistakes? And kind of like I said, have we actually learned their mistake yet? Or does each generation learn this mistake anew? Because there's certain things that it's funny when I see churches, or like one example, and is when churches are like, oh, we have no young people, let's start a praise band and maybe that music will draw people in. And I'll be honest, that solution is about 20 years too late. It would have worked in the early 2000s and it does not work today. But it's funny how some of the solutions that churches come up with like what to do to change these declining trends, they're out of date. It was too little too late. So the question is, what's needed now? And kind of sitting with the, like, what is our response for right now, for this generation, for looking at where we are going? And the question even is, what does the promised land look like for us today?
We have competition that they didn't have in the promised land or in their journey through the wilderness. We have sports and the scheduling of activities all weekend long and conflicting with church services on Sunday morning, these games and then the leagues that the kids are participating in become the family priority. And the whole focus of the family is not toward Sunday, is church. When I grew up, that's whatever that it did. Now it's sports. And that is a huge conflicting thing for us and our future.
So I'm going to name sports the Amalekites. Going to brunch may be the Canaanites.
And what
There-
about all the stores that are open? You know, stores didn't used to be open. You can do anything any time of day or night sometimes.
We'll call that the Pejusites. There's a lot of tribes that live in the land of Canaan. And so like it's different and it's not. Like, yeah, we have competition. We do. So did they. Are they giants that we're afraid of is the question.
So sports mentality is a giant. Yeah.
It's having all the pleasures of life and none of the responsibility or something. I don't know.
So I will always put out there that people make time for what they value.
Mhm.
And one of the things that I think is interesting is that if people find sports more valuable than church, my question is why? Because the creep of youth sports into Sunday, there was enough people over enough time that thought that that was more valuable. And I don't think shaming families for making that choice is the correct solution. I always want to say, what are you getting there that you aren't getting here? Why did you make this choice? How did this transition happen? What are you getting there that you aren't getting here? Because there are reasons, and understanding those reasons, I think will call that like sending the spies into the land of Canaan to discuss like, why have you fortified this city? Why have you changed your priorities? What's going on? Yeah, Mary Ellen?
Well, I think you're having a bottom up change where the sports and the dedication to the sports starts with the child, not with the parents. The child enjoys it. The child has the camaraderie of the team. The child has a coach who is his moral compass now. And the family is buying into whatever the sport experience is for that child. And I really had an awakening moment when I was still working, and this is going to go back 30 years. But one father was explaining to me why a child in middle school participating in a hockey game at 10 o'clock on a Thursday night was more important than getting a good night's sleep and coming to school on Friday refreshed and ready to be a student. And I never came to terms with that. A child's hockey game at 10 o'clock on a Thursday night. But I don't believe the parents were pushing that on the child. It was the child who wanted to participate, who was good, who wanted to continue. And then that's the way the rink availability was put into place. I don't know how you fight that.
Larry?
But the parents bought into it.
Yes, but
The facilitators, and so the parents wanted it probably just as much as the child.
the parents are getting something out of it as well, though, as far as the experience goes. So it becomes a family experience.
And that's why I say there is a reason. And if it's a family experience, sounds like that's not happening other places. So there's always a reason. People make choices. I believe that most people are as rational as I am. So with that, thank you all for hanging on. We are well past our time. Shall we close ourselves in prayer today?
Okay.
All right, let us pray. Gracious and loving God, as we're discussing, it looks like there are giants in the land. The giants have changed. The giants are no longer just tribes of people in fortified cities, but cultural movements that have grown over time. And challenging them does feel like a David and Goliath situation. There's no doubt about that. But God, we are looking for your guidance. We trust that you're with us and that you are ready to lead us. We know that we can't do this on our own. That's the one thing that we have learned again and again, is if we rely on our own strength, it will never be enough. So God, we ask that you empower us and you guide us. You guide our decision-making, you guide our discernment, you guide our conversations, that we might do so compassionately, so that we might inspire instead of spreading doom and gloom, that we might be able to rally the people and bring people together, because ultimately your message is one of hope and love and belonging, and we believe that that message is desperately needed in our world today. So inspire us anew. Help us to be the leaders that you ask us to be, and help us to rise to the occasion and not be intimidated by the giants in the land. So we pray all these things in the name of Jesus. Amen.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks,
Thanks,
Chris.
Chris.
Good, everyone.
Yeah. Have a lovely day, everyone.
Uh,